This is a time of a pandemic when we are in a life or death mode. So why wouldn't we vote for $73 billion? That doesn't even scratch the surface in terms of Pentagon spending.
That's the voice of Congresswoman Barbara Lee, representing the 13th District of California. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button for our 70th episode.
70 episodes. That's impressive. Wouldn't that make this the podcast's platinum anniversary episode? Do we get any gifts?
I'm still waiting for my platinum microphone. I think that would be appropriate. But while I am waiting for the mail, we did get some great guests lined up for this week. I start off in early warning talking to Akshai Vikram before he finished his fellowship about his new report, which was released last week, The New Nuclear Arms Race, The Outlook for Avoiding Catastrophe, where he lays out what a new president should do to stop the new arms race and restart arms control. You can find the full report on our website, plowshares.org.
And after that, I talked to progressive leader, Representative Barbara Lee of California. Together, we discussed how the politics of Pentagon spending are felt in the halls of Congress and how things might play out in the future.
And lastly, yours truly answers a question about nuclear winter in this week's Q&A segment. If you want your question answered on air, remember to tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org. We love hearing from you.
As always, please click the subscribe button and give us a rating. And if you really like what you hear, remember to tell a friend about the show this week. You, our listeners, are our biggest promoters. We really appreciate it.
With that said, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today, I'm joined by Akshai Vikram, Hale Fellow here at Plowshares Fund and author of a new report on the U.S.-Russia arms race. Akshai, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Michelle.
So, as you know, we have 7 minutes to cover this week's nuclear news, which is going to be all about the arms race. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Awesome. So in your report, you write about how the nuclear arms race is back and the traditional brakes, arms control treaties, are weakened or non-existent. How did we end up in this situation?
So over the course of the Cold War, leaders in both the US and the Soviet Union realized how close they were to a nuclear catastrophe. And they put in place a series of arms control measures to rein in that arms race. And over the last 2 decades, we've lost 2 of the 3 most important pillars of that regime, and we're in danger of losing the 3rd. So starting back in 2001, George W. Bush announced that the U.S. was going to withdraw from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And former Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz has called this possibly the biggest contributor to the current U.S.-Russia arms race. And then since that time, Russia has responded by building all these new nuclear weapons systems and delivery mechanisms, and this has attracted a lot of attention to Washington. At the same time, in the last couple of years, Russia has violated the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF, and that was the main treaty that kind of signaled the end of the Cold War. And the Trump administration, rather short-sightedly, decided to abandon that agreement entirely rather than try to negotiate Russia back into compliance. So you take all this combined with the fact that the only remaining limit on US-Russia nuclear deployments is the New START treaty, and that treaty is going to expire next year unless the next president extends it. And you realize that we're in a very dangerous position, one that we haven't seen in quite a long time, where a lot of the Cold War arms control treaties that used to protect us are gone.
So when we say arms race, what does that mean? What types of technologies and dynamics are we seeing?
So it's bad enough that we've lost all these important treaties. But what's even more dangerous, perhaps, is that we've lost these treaties at the same time that the US and Russia are building all of these new weapon systems weapon systems that they frankly don't need and that make them less safe rather than more safe. So let me just give you a couple examples. The US is slated to build this new intercontinental ballistic missile, which is going to cost several hundreds of billions of dollars. This is a weapon that is most likely, according to former Secretary William Perry, to lead to an accidental nuclear war. And it's also a weapon that we don't need. We have nuclear submarines that can retaliate against a first strike on the United States. We have aircraft that can be recalled in case of a crisis that can also deliver nuclear weapons. Going back as far as the Nixon administration, we've had cabinet secretaries saying this is an outdated weapon, and yet we continue to funnel money into this dangerous program. At the same time, Trump has introduced these low-yield nuclear weapons, these so-called tactical nuclear weapons. Now, we already had low-yield nuclear weapons in Europe, and this decision to double down on a new type of nuclear weapon is one that Joe Biden has come out against, and one that might not last in a new administration, but it's already been deployed, and it's very dangerous and difficult to cut back on a defense contract once it's already been implemented. The Russians are building new hypersonic nuclear weapons systems. That name is somewhat misleading because they're not necessarily much faster than current nuclear weapons delivery systems. But as the Carnegie Endowment's James Acton and several others have argued, they increase ambiguity and they threaten to make it less clear what the line is between nuclear and non-nuclear missiles. So you take all of that together with the treaty collapses, the Russian violations in violation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and it makes for a very ominous circumstance and threatens to put us back in the situation we were during the Cold War when Gorbachev said those types of missiles increase the risk of a nuclear accident. So I think that this election year, we should all take some time to take a step back and look at the nuclear weapons arms control regime as a whole and realize how much we've lost and how much is at stake.
I think it's really interesting how you pull out both the internal, domestic dynamics in countries that are driving these programs, as well as the, international, what's the other person building as a reason for the race? Yeah,
I think it's really difficult when you're in the middle of an arms race to just maintain objectivity. And that's what I really strive for with this report. There's a saying about arms races that everyone thinks it's the other guy's fault. And that the U.S. Pentagon is saying, well, we're just building this because the Russians have this, whereas the Russians are saying, well, we're just building this because the U.S. violated or destroyed this treaty. And regardless of who started the problem, we end up building more and more nuclear weapons that we don't need, that are making it more likely that they accidentally or purposefully will be used.
So that's where we've been. That's where we are now. There's going to be a new U.S. president in January of 2021, either a second Trump administration or the first Biden administration. What recommendations do you have for the new president?
So I think that the first thing that has to be done is we have to stop the bleeding of arms control. And that has to start with the extension of the New START treaty. Without that treaty, it's going to be very difficult to continue to pursue reductions with Russia and really have any sort of arms control dialogue. The second thing I think the US president would need to do is reduce the risk of accidental launch. Now, there are a number of ways to do this. The ones I discuss in the report are declaring a no first use policy, ending launch on warning, the idea that we would launch our ICBMs because we think the Russians are launching an attack before we're even sure that the Russians are launching an attack, and that we would cancel the new ICBM program. And then finally, the third step that I laid out in the report was that we need to work with Russia to scale back some of the new systems that we've introduced. So, for example, the U.S. Does not plan to put nuclear warheads on any sort of hypersonic missile. The Russians do, and that creates an ambiguity problem. So we could work with the Russians to say, listen, you can have these missiles, but please just don't put nuclear weapons on them so that we know which of your weapon systems are nuclear capable and which ones are not. The next president can also work with Congress to get rid of Trump's low-yield nuclear weapon. This is a weapon that we don't need and that we should, frankly, never have deployed in the first place. And I think that if we dedicate ourselves once again to diplomacy on arms control, we might have a chance to reining in this arms race.
So where can listeners go to read your report?
So the report is available at plowshares.org. As Joe used to say, that's plowshares spelled the British King James way with the O-U-G-H.
Fantastic. Akshay, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Michelle.
In 1998, Congresswoman Barbara Lee was elected to Congress, representing what is now California's 13th congressional district. And in 2001, she received national attention as the only member of Congress to oppose the authorization for the use of military force in the wake of the September 11th attacks. Currently, Congresswoman Lee serves on the Budget Committee and the Powerful Appropriations Committee, which oversees all federal government spending. She's the only African-American woman in Democratic leadership, serving as co-chair of the Policy and Steering Committee, and she is also co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Congresswoman Lee, thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be with you, and hello to everybody listening. And thanks to Plowshares for everything that you're doing out there, plowing away until justice is done on all fronts. So thank you.
Thank you. Last month, you sponsored an amendment, which Plowshares supported, in the House that would have reduced Pentagon spending by 10%, or about $74 billion. It would have transferred that money to a domestic federal grant program to fund healthcare, housing, childcare, and education for cities with a poverty rate of 25% or more. Now, this would seem to be a reasonable approach to dealing with the current national crisis. With a faltering economy, resurgent coronavirus, and systemic racial injustice. Meanwhile, the U.S. defense budget at $740 billion is larger than the next 10 nations combined, 8 of which happen to be our friends. Yet the House rejected this amendment, this modest amendment, by roughly a 3-to-1 margin. Democrats split and Republicans united in voting no. And a similar bill in the Senate, led by Senator Bernie Sanders, was voted down as well, splitting Democrats. So, this vote to me says volumes about what is wrong with our political system right now. And I'm so glad we have you here to help us unpack what happened. So give us your sense. First of all, what motivated you to take the lead on this amendment, and how do you interpret what happened?
Sure, Tom. And let me just say, first of all, this was so modest. It was so moderate until I was almost like, why are we just doing 10% when, in fact, we know that there's at least $350 billion that we can cut, which I've laid out in another resolution, which shows where the cuts can come from and will not hamper our national security, nor will it hurt our troops. In fact, we want to support our troops and make sure they have everything that they have. So, backstory, I've been doing this for years and years and years in terms of trying to get this Pentagon spending under control. I formerly worked for a great warrior, Congressman Ron Dellums, who came to Congress against the Vietnam War. That was his platform, trying to end the war. Ron joined the Armed Services Committee, and then he became the first and only, so far, chair of the House Armed Services Committee. And I had the privilege to work with him for many, many years and got a chance to look at this defense budget very closely. And Ron championed this out from my district, of course, Oakland, Berkeley, a very progressive district. And Ron always had the support to reorder our priorities in this country in terms of spending. So for me, this has been a life's journey since the 70s, working on it as a staff person. Then I went to the legislature, of course, and then into Congress. And so I've been trying every year. Sometimes we try a 2% cut, sometimes a 3% cut. This year, Senator Sanders, myself, and Congressman Mark Pocan decided, well, let's try a 10% cut, given the pandemic now. And given that under Trump, this budget has increased by, $100 billion in the last few years. And in fact, that's a 20% increase. And we need those modest resources, $74 billion. Come on, for housing and public health and to save lives and education, you name it. And so this was so modest. We should have had 250 votes for this, because how in the world can you not want to fund life-saving right now? This is a time of a pandemic when we are in a life or death mode. So why wouldn't we vote for $73 billion? That doesn't even scratch the surface in terms of Pentagon spending. It doesn't even touch our national security. It does not make us vulnerable. It does not touch jobs. It does not touch any issues as it relates to troops. We made sure we said very clearly that we wanted to support our troops. They need more. Our troops sometimes have to rely on food stamps and Section 8. And so it's like, come on. 90, what did we get? 93 votes? 92? Right. I mean, it's like, okay. But then on the final passage of the bill, I don't remember how many votes we got. Maybe, 40? Maybe 45? Yeah. Yeah. So I guess you could see that as progress. I mean, I think it is because at least we have members now saying, 93 members saying a 10% cut is reasonable. But at the end of the day, they voted for $740 billion. And so we have a lot of work to do, but Congresswoman Pocan and myself, we're starting a defense spending caucus. We're going to begin to educate people, and what Plowshares is doing around the country with members, it's extremely important now, because we have got to begin to help members feel like that it's politically doable to vote for a cut in Pentagon spending. We've tried to do this on the Budget Committee. I've tried to do it through appropriations. We tried to do it on the floor, but we're just getting started, and we're going to keep going.
I appreciate that. Well, give us a sense of what it's like in Congress. Why is it so hard for members of Congress to vote for what you said is a modest defense reduction?
I think a lot of members are concerned quite naturally about national security, especially newer members, and being soft on, quote, terrorism or being anti-military. And all these concerns are valid. Jobs in their districts, the military-industrial complex is vast. Defense contractors cite their plants and cite their operations in members' districts and create jobs. And we don't do a good job explaining how more jobs can be created through these resources than what are there now, with good benefits, which are environmentally green, sound jobs and job training and, the whole 9 yards. We can create really good paying jobs if we had the resources to do it. I went through base closings in my district when Ron was in Congress and I was in the California state legislature. 5 bases were closed, but we had conversion plans, and we saw this peace dividend and how we transitioned from a military to a peace economy in my district. So it can be done. So I don't think members think and understand how it can be done. And so it's a very difficult vote for a variety of reasons, but mostly national security, mostly being concerned about being soft on terrorism, and about, of course, the jobs in their district.
And what about the issue of campaign donations from defense contractors? How much of a role does that play in this?
Well, I really don't know, because I don't look at members' contributions, because I don't believe you can be bought and sold like that. 1 or 2 campaign contributions from a defense contractor or from any industry shouldn't require you to vote a certain way. And I would say 90%, especially of my colleagues who are Democrats, they don't switch votes for money or campaign contributions. So I don't look at it that way. But, I don't think that members vote for the defense budget because they receive campaign contributions from defense contracts. For the most part, I think it's the jobs that they don't want to see lost, knowing that will be a political problem if, in fact, you vote to get rid of someone's job. I mean, that's the reality of it.
Got it. Now, tell us a little bit about your future plans for this. You talked about the Defense Spending Caucus. Do you plan to offer this amendment again next year? And if so, what lessons might you have learned from this experience that you might apply going forward?
Sure. Well, Mark and Bernie and myself are going to get together, and we have to talk about this, because 93 votes, that's a good vote, given from where people started. And so we want to get members who wouldn't normally be part of that, who voted and who were members who we never thought would vote for this type of cut, and get their thinking on it before we move forward. And so we want to do this in a collaborative way, starting early, building the movement on the outside, because let me tell you, external organizing is what's happening. So we have to have youth, and we have to have the voices of the people insisting that their members of Congress understand why these cuts are necessary. And so it's going to take a heck of a lot. It'll be very exciting, complex, but exciting. And I think we're moving forward on this.
And last question, give us your sense of this political moment, right? I mean, here we are in an historic time with the coronavirus, with the racial injustice that has been exposed, with the economy in the shape it's in. Do you see potential in this moment for real change?
Yes, I do. And I think, that there's a convergence of policies, issues, movements, people together now. You see intersectionality at its best. And out of the trauma of the past, we see a silver lining. And a couple of things. I really am so proud of our young people and Black Lives Matter and our dreamers, everyone who hit the streets after the brutal murder of Mr. Floyd. We see now, and the country, the world sees the dictatorial track that this administration is on, sending in their militia to, try to really quell dissent, which is what dictators do when there's opposition, So I think people are seeing this country for what it is under Donald Trump and coming together and say, we have to, one, protect our democracy. And that's extremely important. But two, in terms of racial justice, so many progressives talk about economic justice, which we should do and fight to close the wage gap and fight for economic equality. But very seldom did I ever hear, and I fight with my great progressive colleagues all the time, you don't hear them talk about racial equity and racial justice. I say, look, when we talk about economic justice, we got to talk about racial and economic justice. I'm beginning to hear that now. And I'm beginning to, like I have a resolution, HR 100, that sets up a truth commission, truth, racial healing, and transformation, to really look at how the manifestations of systemic racism are still with us, i.e. the disparities in healthcare, the disparities in housing, wages, all of the issues that African Americans and people of color deal with, and how that connects to 401 years ago when the first enslaved people were chained and brought to America and enslaved for over 250 years. And then alongside that, working on reparations, HR 40. And so we're working together with these two bills. And I think that I see more members beginning to understand why we have to repair the damage through reparations, but also understanding they don't have the historical context of the chains of slavery and what happened after slavery in terms of the black codes, in terms of segregation, Jim Crow, lynching. I mean, in California, housing, we weren't able to desegregate until I think it was 64. My dad was in the military, lieutenant colonel, 25 years. He and my mother went to buy a house in my district in San Leandro, turned away, run out of town because they were black. I represent that district now, that city, San Leandro. So there's progress, but now we've got to leap forward and break all these chains of slavery. And so I see that as this is a transformational moment where everyone is coming together to understand what systemic racism is, but how it's connected to 401 years ago, and how this country needs this day of reckoning and truth-telling, because it's never had it. Over 40 countries have. The United States hasn't.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee, thank you so much for being here. It's been a true pleasure, and I wish you the best of luck in all your work.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you and to Plowshares for everything you all do, because we couldn't do this inside work without you. I still am an activist, and I want you to know that. And so activism runs in my DNA, and so whenever I need to march, when we get out of this pandemic, I'm there as an activist doing my thing with you too. So I understand the importance and value of what you're doing. Thank you again.
Letters, we get letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now, everyone's favorite segment, the nuclear Q&A. This week's question comes from Frank, who writes to us from Massachusetts, quote, "Can you explain the science behind nuclear winter? I hear it all the time, but I don't know what it means. How would it take place, and why should we be concerned?" Unquote.
So nuclear winter is shorthand for the climate effects that are caused by a nuclear war. And the theory is that the soot and the smoke that are caused by nuclear weapons being dropped on cities would reach the upper stratosphere as they're heated by the sun. And at that level of atmosphere, they can't be washed out by rain, so they would stay around for years and spread globally. They would block the sun's rays, which would lower the Earth's temperature on the surface to the point that it disrupts the global food supply, which leads to the other phrase you often hear associated with nuclear winter, nuclear famine. So in 2007, Alan Robach and his research team at Rutgers found in their modeling of a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan. So they said that maybe 100 nuclear weapons would be used total by the two countries. There would be 5 million tons of smoke, and it would drop the global temperatures by an average of over 1 degree Celsius across the world. And it would lead to a 20 to 40% reduction in global food production, and that would lead to widespread famine. And in addition, there would be ozone depletion, leading to an increase in ultraviolet radiation hitting the Earth's surface. So what does all this catastrophe mean? It would mean that more people could die outside of India and Pakistan because of these indirect effects. And this modeling is for a limited war. So I say theory, but there are historical examples, like the 1815 volcanic eruption in Indonesia that led to a cooling across the world by 0.5 degrees Celsius. And that resulted in 1816 being called a year without summer. And it saw crop-killing frosts every month of the summer in New England. It led to huge increases in grain prices and contributed to the mass migration westward in the United States. Now, there's some disagreements about how much soot would be produced in such an exchange and the overall level of climate impact. And most notably, you see disagreements between what Robach has put forward and Los Alamos National Lab. But to me, this is a bit like deck chairs on the Titanic. Millions would be dead within the annihilated cities, and the impact would be felt around the world, whether by disruptions in the economy or the food supply. So the takeaway is that nuclear war doesn't have to be big to devastate the world. We're talking about 100 nuclear weapons in that scenario. There's currently 13,000 in stockpiles around the world. And so you start to see just how dangerous of a situation we're in, and this sense that a nuclear war must never be fought, and it can never be won. And so we need to do what we can to get rid of them.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Michelle. And thanks, Frank from Massachusetts. And remember, if you would like to get your question on the air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.